Did you know that this Divine Mercy Sunday, you can block evil from entering your home in a way that no other Sunday of the year allows you to do? This isn't a vague promise. It isn't a pious expression. It's something Saint Teresa of Jesus put into writing with a precision that her Carmelite sisters applied for centuries within their own homes. Something concrete, something that has steps, that has an order, that has an exact moment within this Sunday when its power reaches its highest point. And the question nobody asks is this: why this Sunday and not another? What is it about Divine Mercy Sunday that makes it the most powerful day of the entire year for sealing your home against evil? Because Saint Teresa of Jesus didn't discover this by accident. She lived it first in her own cell, in her own space, before she ever wrote a single word about it. And what she wrote is not an abstract reflection on divine grace. It is a practical teaching on how the soul that understands the spiritual weight of this Sunday can use it to transform the territory of its home in a permanent way. There is something in that sealing, that blocking, that Saint Teresa of Jesus described that goes much deeper than you might imagine. And it has to do with something that is very likely happening right now inside the walls of your home without you even knowing it. Write in the comments right now, "I am blocking evil from entering my home." Write it, because declaring it out loud on this Sunday is already the first act of protection. And subscribe right now by tapping the button you see on your screen. Every week we share revelations from Saint Teresa of Jesus that you won't find anywhere else. And what's coming in the next videos is something you simply cannot afford to miss. There is something Saint Teresa of Jesus understood about the Christian home that most Catholics today have never heard in a homily, never read in a book of devotion, never encountered anywhere in their religious formation. She understood it because she lived it first. Because before she was the foundress of 17 convents, before she was a doctor of the church, before she was the woman who reformed the Carmelite order with a determination that shocked half of Spain, Saint Teresa of Jesus was a woman who lived in a home, a real home, with walls, with doors, with rooms where things happened that were not always holy. And in that home, long before she ever entered the convent, she learned something that she would spend decades trying to put into words: that the space where the soul lives is never neutral, never. That every home has a spiritual temperature that no thermometer can measure, but that is felt. That affects those who live in it in ways that no science can quantify, but that anyone with any interior life recognizes without needing anyone to explain it to them. In the book of her life, Saint Teresa of Jesus describes with an honesty that is still striking today the spiritual battles that took place within the walls of her family home in Avila. She doesn't describe them as exceptional events, as mystical phenomena reserved for extraordinary souls. She describes them as the ordinary experience of any home where the desire for God and the resistance to good live side by side. A home where people pray and also sin, where they love and also wound each other, where grace comes in through one door and the enemy looks for another. That description doesn't belong to another century. It has the exact temperature of what is happening right now in millions of Catholic homes, in the US, in the UK, in Australia, where families are trying to live their faith in the middle of a world that pushes in the opposite direction. A world that has found ways to enter the home that previous generations never had to face. That slips in through screens, through headphones, through content that children consume alone in their rooms while parents believe the house is safe because the front door is locked. What Saint Teresa of Jesus understood is that the home has a spiritual life of its own, not independent of the people who live in it, but built by them, sustained by them, and also dismantled by them when certain practices that the Catholic tradition has always considered essential are abandoned. A home is not just the place where you sleep. It is the place where your soul breathes between one moment of grace and the next. It is the space where your children learn without anyone explicitly teaching them whether God exists or not. whether prayer works or not, whether evil is real or just a word adults use to frighten. Every object in that house, every word spoken within those walls, every habit of prayer that is sustained or abandoned is building or destroying something that cannot be seen, but can be felt. Something that Saint Teresa of Jesus called, in the language of her time, the spiritual climate of the domestic soul, the air that the heart breathes when it is home. And here is the first question that this Sunday demands we ask ourselves. What is the spiritual climate of your home right now? Not the one it had when you were married, not the one it had when you baptized your children, not the one you remember from the last Holy Week when the whole family was together and prayed the rosary without anyone making excuses. The climate of right now, of this week, of these days when the world came in through a phone screen and settled into the dining room and the bedrooms and the moments that used to be quiet and are now filled with constant noise that leaves no room for God to be heard, even when He is calling. Because that climate is exactly what determines whether the door of your home to evil is open or closed. And Saint Teresa of Jesus knew this with a clarity that her writings document page after page, with concrete examples, with precise warnings, with the authority of someone who had observed the human soul in its domestic setting for decades of community life, and had learned to read the signs that most people don't even know exist. In The Way of Perfection, Saint Teresa of Jesus spends entire pages describing how the spiritual atmosphere of a community, her convent in her case, but the principle applies with equal precision to any Christian home, is built or destroyed by accumulation. Not by one serious sin, not by one single moment of abandonment, but by the sum of small daily decisions that nobody notices, because each one seems insignificant on its own. A prayer that gets shortened because there's a rush. A crucifix that gets taken down when a room is rearranged and nobody ever hangs it back up. A blessing before meals that gets dropped because schedules no longer line up and gathering, everyone feels like too much trouble. A rosary that gets put off until tomorrow for weeks on end, until tomorrow stops being a real possibility and becomes a suspended intention that nobody mentions because nobody wants to feel the guilt of naming it. None of these things looks like an open door, but Saint Teresa of Jesus insisted that the sum of all of them creates exactly that, an opening. A space where something that is not light can settle in without announcing itself, without asking permission, without anyone in the house knowing exactly when it arrived or how long it has been there. And then Divine Mercy Sunday arrives. And with it comes something that Saint Teresa of Jesus knew deeply. The certainty that there are moments in the Church's calendar where the grace of God bends toward the soul with a generosity that has no equal in the rest of the year. Moments when heaven is not only available but actively leaning toward the good of the soul that comes in faith and divine mercy. Sunday, the Sunday that closes the octave of Easter, is one of those moments. Perhaps the highest of all when it comes to the availability of God's mercy to heal what is broken, seal what is open, restore what has been damaged by neglect and habit, and the spiritual weariness that ordinary life deposits on the soul without anyone asking for it. And what Saint Teresa of Jesus left written about how to use that moment for the good of the home is something no Catholic family should let pass without knowing, because what comes next changes the way you understand what can happen inside the walls of your house before this Sunday is over. Saint Teresa of Jesus did not speak about evil as though it was something that arrives from the outside without warning, like a storm that falls on the home without anyone having invited it. She spoke about it with the precision of someone who had observed it closely for decades, who had learned to recognize its methods with the same clarity that an experienced physician recognizes the symptoms of an illness before the patient has even finished describing what they feel. And what she described was not an enemy that breaks down doors. It was an enemy that waits, that watches, that finds the cracks the soul itself has been opening without realizing it, and uses them with a patience that defies any human notion of time. an enemy that doesn't need great victories because it knows that small victories, accumulated in silence over months and years, produce the same result as a catastrophic defeat, but without generating the alarm that would have motivated a response. In the book of her life, Saint Teresa of Jesus identifies the first of those cracks with a clarity that is uncomfortable because it touches something that almost everyone recognizes in their own home if they are honest with themselves. She calls it the cooling of interior prayer. Not the total abandonment of prayer, because that would be visible, that would raise an alarm, that would provoke some kind of reaction in the conscience, but something more subtle and therefore more dangerous. Prayer that continues in its outward form while emptying from within. The rosary recited with the lips while the mind is planning tomorrow's dinner or replaying the conversation from this morning that still feels awkward. Grace before meals said out of habit without any interior voice, genuinely acknowledging before whom it is being spoken. The sign of the cross traced on the body as an automatic gesture the hand makes on its own, while the heart is somewhere else entirely. Saint Teresa of Jesus warned that this kind of prayer, emptied from within, does not protect the home. It leaves it, in her spiritual understanding, like a house with its walls standing and its locks in place, but with the keys left in the lock on the outside. The appearance of security exists. The real security does not. The second crack that Saint Teresa of Jesus identifies in her writings is the absence of spoken prayer within the home. This was not for her a minor detail or a secondary element of domestic spiritual life. In the way of perfection, she gives extraordinary attention to vocal prayer, defending it with arguments her contemporaries did not expect from someone with her level of contemplative life. For Saint Teresa of Jesus, the human voice speaking the name of God within a space carries a spiritual weight that silent prayer alone does not reach in the same way. Not because silence has no value, not because mental prayer is inferior, but because the voice does something that thought does not. It occupies physical space. It leaves the body and fills the room. It travels through the air of the house. And that occupation of space by the name of God is, in Teresa's understanding, a concrete way of claiming that territory for the sacred, of filling it with something that leaves no empty room for what seeks to settle where there is silence. When the voice disappears from a home, when no one speaks a prayer out loud within those walls for days and weeks, something in that territory is left unclaimed. And what is left unclaimed eventually gets occupied by whatever is available to occupy it. The third crack is more painful to name because it touches the interior life of families at their most private and most fragile. Saint Teresa of Jesus describes it in The Interior Castle as the habitual presence of words that destroy. Not necessarily blasphemies, not necessarily serious and conscious offenses against God, but the silent accumulation of hurtful words thrown out without thinking in the heat of a difficult moment, of criticisms that become habit until the home breathes them as though they were normal, of silences heavy with resentment that settle between family members and create within the home a climate of darkness that Saint Teresa of Jesus compares in her writings to closing the windows of a room for months. The air that remains inside is not the same as what entered when the house was last opened. Something in it has changed in a way that is invisible, but that the lungs can feel. And in that stale atmosphere, Saint Teresa of Jesus taught with the authority of someone who had governed communities of women for decades, evil finds the conditions it needs. Because where there is a wound left unhealed, where there is a resentment left unconfessed, where there is pain that no one has yet brought to prayer because moving it hurts more than leaving it still, there is a crack that does not close on its own, that waits, that with time grows larger, not smaller. And this is precisely where Divine Mercy Sunday enters with a force that no other Sunday of the year possesses, with an availability of grace that the Church has recognized as extraordinary and that Saint Teresa of Jesus would have recognized immediately as one of those moments in the liturgical calendar where heaven bends toward the soul with a generosity that doubles and triples what the same action would produce at any ordinary time. Because this Sunday is not simply another day of grace among the many the liturgical year contains. It is the day when the Church proclaims that the mercy of God is available in a way that exceeds the ordinary measure, that the cracks that have been opening in the Christian home throughout the year can be sealed with an effectiveness that at any other moment would require months of sustained and consistent spiritual work. It is the day when what seems too damaged to be repaired can be repaired, when what seems too open to be closed can be closed, when what seems too dark to be lit can be lit, and what Saint Teresa of Jesus taught about how to draw on that power for the good of the home begins with something that appears simple, but that in her spiritual understanding is the most decisive act a family can perform within their own walls before this Sunday comes to an end. The question Saint Teresa of Jesus would have asked any family coming to her, seeking to protect their home, would not have been about the sacred objects they kept in the house. She would not have asked whether there was a crucifix in every room, or whether the holy water was fresh, or whether the rosary was prayed every day. She would have asked a different question, one that goes deeper than any of those. The question Saint Teresa of Jesus would have asked is this: who in your home still has a wound that has not been brought to God? Not an old wound that time has gradually softened until it became manageable. A living wound. One of those that gets touched without warning when someone says a particular word at the dinner table, and the silence that falls is different from every other silence. One of those that appears out of nowhere when a certain date arrives on the calendar, or when a particular person's name comes up in conversation, and something in the atmosphere of the room shifts in a way that everyone feels, though nobody names it. Because Saint Teresa of Jesus knew, with the wisdom of someone who had observed the human soul for decades of intense interior life, and the governance of communities of women with their conflicts and their sorrows and their complicated histories, that evil does not need a wide open door to enter a home. A wound that no one has yet brought to the mercy of God is enough. And Divine Mercy Sunday is precisely the day when that hidden place can be opened. Not because God's grace is greater that day than any other in any absolute sense, because God's grace does not have quantitative gradations the soul can measure, but because the Church, in her wisdom, has concentrated in that Sunday an invitation that the rest of the year does not make with the same urgency or the same clarity. Bring what you have not yet been able to bring. Bring the wound you have been carrying without a name, the one that describing to God out loud costs you too much because naming it would mean acknowledging it's there and that you have been letting it grow in the dark. Bring the resentment you have disguised as prudent distance, because calling it resentment would mean you'd have to do something about it. Bring the pain you have buried under so much dirt that you can barely feel it anymore, but that is still working in silence at the roots of everything you do and everything you say and everything you teach your children without realizing you are teaching it to them. Saint Teresa of Jesus describes in the interior castle a phenomenon that anyone who has lived in a family for years will recognize without needing anyone to explain it. She calls it the invisible weight that accumulates in spaces where the soul has not settled its accounts with God and with itself. It is not a presence that can be seen or heard. It is something felt in the atmosphere of the home, the way humidity is felt before rain, without anyone being able to point to exactly where it's coming from, but with the growing certainty that it is there and that something in the atmosphere has changed in a way that corresponds to no visible exterior cause. Families who experience this describe it in different words, but with a common thread that is impossible to ignore. A sense that the peace has left the house without anyone having consciously driven it out, without any dramatic event that would justify its absence. A difficulty in prayer that wasn't there before. A resistance that appears when one tries to kneel, that is not laziness, but something that feels more like a weight pressing down. An irritability between family members that no one can explain, because there is no concrete reason for it if you look only at the external circumstances. A sadness that enters in the mornings and does not correspond to any objective situation in that family's life. Saint Teresa of Jesus would not have hesitated to recognize those signs. She would have called them by their name with the direct gentleness that characterized her entire way of guiding souls. The consequence of a home where unhealed wounds have gradually created cracks, and where those cracks have allowed the entry of something that has no light of its own, but knows very well how to feed on the darkness that is already inside. And she would have said the same thing she wrote for her Carmelite sisters, when the atmosphere of a community became stale in that way, without anyone being able to point to a single cause. That the first step is not a specific prayer, not a sacred object placed in a particular spot, not any outward gesture, however well-intentioned. The first step is interior. It is the honest and courageous decision to bring the wound to the mercy of God, before asking God to protect the space where that wound has been living unhealed, growing in the shadows where no one was looking directly at it, working quietly inside the home with the patient silence of everything that remains in the dark too long. This is what makes Divine Mercy Sunday the most powerful moment of the year for the protection of the Christian home. Not only because the grace available that day is extraordinary in liturgical terms, but because on that Sunday, the entire church is oriented toward a single mystery with a clarity that the rest of the year does not have, that the mercy of God has no condition, no measure, no depth that human pain can reach the bottom of, that it reaches as far down as human suffering goes, and deeper still, that there is no wound too old to be healed, no resentment too hardened to be dissolved, no darkness too well established to be reached and displaced by that love which this Sunday the Church proclaims with an urgency that the soul that truly hears it never entirely forgets. And here, Saint Teresa of Jesus left planted in her writings a question that her most attentive readers have always found unsettling in its honesty. Can a home be truly protected from evil if those who live in it have not yet brought their own wounds to God's mercy? Can the holy water, can the crucifix on the wall, can the sacred image in the place of honor do their full work in a home where hearts are still not fully open? Or is the outward protection of a home whose inhabitants have not sought interior healing like building a wall over a crack that is still widening underneath? Saint Teresa of Jesus does not answer this in a single sentence in any of her major texts. But the direction of all her teaching on the interior life points toward an answer that becomes clearer and more inevitable the longer one contemplates it honestly. And that answer is the one that opens the way to the concrete acts that this Divine Mercy Sunday places within reach of any family willing to do what this Sunday asks before asking for what this Sunday can give. Saint Teresa of Jesus left written in the way of perfection something that her Carmelite sisters copied out by hand and passed down from generation to generation for centuries, as though it were a treasure that could not be lost under any circumstance. That the consecration of the home to God is not a gesture made once in a lifetime and then forgotten because it has already been done. It is an act that must be renewed, that must be spoken again with mouth and heart at those moments when God's grace is most disposed to receive it, because at those moments the consecration is not merely renewed on the surface, but deepened, reaching layers of the home and of the souls that inhabit it, that in an ordinary moment wouldn't be accessible in the same way. And Divine Mercy Sunday, the Sunday the Church has recognized as the day of the fullest mercy in the entire liturgical year, is precisely one of those moments, perhaps the highest of all when it comes to the availability of grace to seal what is open and deepen what was already consecrated, but that time and weariness and routine had gradually emptied of its interior content, But what Saint Teresa of Jesus taught about the consecration of the home was not what many people imagine when they hear that word. It was not a complicated ritual requiring extraordinary preparation or special conditions that the ordinary family would struggle to gather. It was not a ceremony that only a priest could preside over, nor a long prayer that had to be memorized word for word to be effective. It was something any mother, any father, any person living alone in a house could do with what they already had: their voice, their faith, their willingness to surrender without holding anything back. It was an interior act accompanied by words spoken aloud within the space to be consecrated. And in her own words, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in The Way of Perfection that the soul that gives itself to God, totally and without reserve, carries with it the space where it lives, transforms it by the very act of inhabiting it with that full surrender, turns it into a place where God's presence has the right to dwell, because it has been invited with genuine freedom and with love that does not negotiate the terms of the giving. That act of surrender has a component that Saint Teresa of Jesus considered absolutely indispensable, and that most Catholic families omit without realizing it, not out of bad will, but simply because no one has ever told them: specificity. It is not enough to say in the heart, silently, with the general intention that the home belongs to God. It must be said with concrete words spoken aloud within that space. The rooms must be named. The people living under that roof must be named, each one by name. The situations that have not yet been resolved must be named and also handed over to the mercy of God, because a consecration that leaves corners unnamed also leaves corners unconsecrated. And Saint Teresa of Jesus knew from her long experience of spiritual life and the governance of communities that evil needs only one corner. The one that was forgotten in a moment of haste or deliberately avoided because naming it before God would have required facing something that still hurts too much to look at directly. The first act that Divine Mercy Sunday places within reach of the Christian home is therefore this: to renew the consecration of the home to God, with voice, with names, with the specific and honest concreteness that Saint Teresa of Jesus considered the true heart of the act. No fixed formula copied from a book of prayers is needed. What is needed is honesty. Standing or kneeling at the center of the house, or in the place where the family gathers for what matters most, and speaking aloud an act of surrender that names each person who lives under that roof, that names each space of the house, that even names the known cracks, the wounds known to be present, the corners where darkness has found entry because weariness or pain or neglect left the door open. Because what is named before God in an act of conscious and deliberate faith is placed under His jurisdiction in a way that what is kept silent or avoided is not. What is kept silent remains in an ambiguous zone where grace can work, but where surrender hasn't yet fully opened the door. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in The Way of Perfection that the soul who gives itself entirely to God need not fear that anything it truly needs will be lacking, because the Lord provides for the one who surrenders without reserve and with the confidence that such surrender will not go unanswered. That surrender without reserve is exactly what the renewed consecration of the home this Sunday must express. Not a conditional surrender shaped by fear that God will not come through. Not a negotiated surrender that keeps certain corners under its own control, because letting them go would feel too vulnerable. But a surrender that opens every interior door of the soul and of the home, and says with both mouth and heart at the same time, "This home is yours. These people are yours. These situations are yours. And what I cannot resolve with my own strength, I hand over to you as well, because you can do what I will never be able to do, no matter how long I try." This act, performed on Divine Mercy Sunday, with full awareness of the extraordinary grace that this day places within reach of any soul that comes in faith, produces something that Saint Teresa of Jesus described as impossible to quantify, but perfectly recognizable to those who experience it. The soul that performs it feels something afterward that was not there before. A lightness that has no rational explanation in terms of the external circumstances, which have not changed. A peace that does not depend on the problems having been resolved, because the problems are still there, but on something in the relationship between that home and God having been restored, deepened, sealed in a way that the cracks that existed before can no longer hold as easily as they did. Something has changed, and that change is the foundation on which the second act of this Sunday builds something even more concrete and more powerful. In almost every Catholic home, there is holy water. In a small font near the front door, in a bottle kept in the main bedroom, somewhere in the house where it arrived one day after a Mass or a visit to the parish, and where it stayed without anyone making a conscious decision about where it ought to be or exactly what it should be used for. And in almost all those homes, the holy water is used the same way. Coming in or going out, sometimes at bedtime, with a brief gesture the hand makes almost on its own. Without the mind fully accompanying it, without faith sustaining it, with the active awareness that gesture deserves and needs in order to produce what the Church knows it can produce when used well. Saint Teresa of Jesus had something very precise to say about this. And what she said was not criticism that came from judgment, but a correction that came from love and from a deep knowledge of what that water can do when used with real faith and what it stops doing when used only out of habit, when the hand touches it, but the heart is somewhere else entirely. In the way of perfection, Saint Teresa of Jesus writes about holy water with a reverence that surprises even readers most familiar with the whole of her work. She does not treat it as a devotional symbol of mainly catechetical or aesthetic value. She does not present it as a gesture of cultural belonging to the Catholic faith that has its worth in what it represents, but not in what it objectively does. She presents it with a conviction that leaves no room for ambiguous readings, as a reality with effective power over the forces of evil, a power the Church recognizes in her liturgy and in her doctrine, that the saints have documented in their writings and testimonies, and that Saint Teresa of Jesus experienced in a personal and direct way in specific moments of her own life, which she narrates in the book of her life, with a precision that does not invite symbolic readings, but describes events that occurred in particular places and at particular times. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in The Way of Perfection that holy water has a particular power against evil spirits, that she herself had experienced this many times throughout her life, and that nothing else she used in moments of spiritual attack had given her the comfort and certainty of protection that water gave her. And she added something that her most attentive readers have always underlined as one of the most important principles of her entire teaching on the spiritual instruments of protection: that the power of holy water does not depend on the quantity used, but on the faith with which it is used. A single drop used with full, deliberate, and conscious faith is worth, in her spiritual understanding, infinitely more than any amount used by habit and without real thought, without the soul that touches it knowing before whom it is acting and what it is asking by acting. Here is the second act that Divine Mercy Sunday places within reach of the Christian home, an act that Saint Teresa of Jesus would have recognized and endorsed without the slightest hesitation: walking through the house with holy water in a deliberate, conscious, actively faithful way, with words spoken aloud in each room, not the quick gesture of a hand that touches the font on the way out the door, something completely different in its intention and in its effect. Taking the holy water, entering each room of the house one by one, and in each room speaking aloud a declaration of faith that claims that specific space for God and closes it against everything that is not His will and His presence. Saint Teresa of Jesus did not leave a fixed formula for this walk because she did not believe in the magic of exact words separated from the faith that sustains them. What matters is not the precise order of terms or the length of the declaration, but the living conviction with which it is spoken, the real awareness of before whom one is acting, the certainty that God hears and that what is asked in His name and with His holy water does not fall into empty space. There is something about this walk that Saint Teresa of Jesus describes with an image that her Carmelite sisters repeated for generations because they found it perfect in its simplicity and its accuracy. That the person who walks through their home with holy water and active faith is like someone lighting a lamp in every room of a house that has been sunk in darkness for too long. Darkness is not argued with. It is not explained to. It is not negotiated with or politely asked to find somewhere else to settle. It is displaced by light because light and darkness cannot occupy the same space at the same time, and light does not have to strain or argue. It only has to be present for darkness to retreat. And holy water used in faith on Divine Mercy Sunday, when the available grace reaches its highest point in the entire liturgical year, is exactly that light coming on in every corner of the home that has been in darkness, filling what was empty, displacing what had settled in the silence and the habit emptied of its spiritual content. But there is a detail in this walk that Saint Teresa of Jesus considered absolutely essential, and that most people who undertake it leave out because no one has explained it to them. A detail that has nothing to do with the water or the words or the order in which the rooms are visited, but with something that must happen inside the heart of the person making the walk before they take the first step out of the central room of the house. A detail that is the reason why the same walk, made with the same water and the same words by two different people in the same home, can produce completely different results. And that detail connects directly to the third act that this Sunday places within reach of the home. The act that Saint Teresa of Jesus considered the most powerful of the three, because it is the only one no person can perform alone. What the heart must carry before walking through the home with holy water this Sunday is something that Saint Teresa of Jesus names in the interior castle with a word that in her mouth never sounded abstract or decorative or reserved for great theologians: humility. Not humility as a virtue displayed in moments of formal prayer and abandoned the moment prayer ends and ordinary life returns with its friction and its impatience and its small daily pride that no one recognizes as such because it has become so habitual that it is no longer noticed. Humility as a real interior, unadorned recognition that the person making that walk does not do so by virtue of accumulated merit, not because they are particularly holy or particularly faithful in their religious practice, not because they have in some way earned the right to have God protect their home by faithful compliance with religious obligations. They do it because God's mercy does not require merit to be received. They do it because this Sunday the Church proclaims with unmistakable clarity that that mercy is available to anyone who comes with empty hands and an open heart, and that empty hands, far from being an obstacle, are exactly the condition God waits for, because they are the only ones He can fill completely. This distinction matters in a way that radically changes what happens during the walk through the rooms of the home. The soul that walks through its house with holy water, convinced that it is performing a powerful act by its own right, convinced that its accumulated devotion and faithfulness to religious practices makes it deserving of a protection that less devout families will not receive, is doing something real, but is losing an essential part of the power that act could have. Because the power of holy water does not flow toward the merit of the one who uses it. It flows toward the faith of the one who uses it. And the highest and most effective faith is not the one that says, I deserve this protection because I have complied. It is the one that says, I deserve nothing, and I ask anyway, with everything in me, because you are merciful, and on this Sunday, your mercy has no limit, and I throw myself into it without conditions, without negotiations, without holding back a single corner of my heart for myself. Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in The Interior Castle that the soul that knows itself in its real smallness, and from that recognized and accepted smallness throws itself into the arms of God, receives more than the soul that arrives with hands full of its own merits presented as the argument for being attended to. Not because merits have no value, not because sustained spiritual effort does not matter, but because the soul that knows its smallness leaves more free space for God to be God within it. It does not arrive full of itself. It arrives empty. And that emptiness is exactly the space that the mercy of God needs to settle into the home with its full richness, without meeting resistance, without having to make its way past spiritual self-sufficiency and pride disguised as devotion that sometimes occupies the place that should be reserved for Him alone. The third act that Saint Teresa of Jesus left, described for the protection of the home in days of extraordinary grace, is the simplest in outward appearance and the deepest in its real effect on the spiritual territory of the home. Family prayer spoken aloud within the walls of the house. Not the private, silent prayer of each family member shut away in their room with their thoughts, but voices gathered in the same space, speaking the name of God together, even if not all of them with the same level of fervor or the same depth of conviction, filling the rooms with that sound that Saint Teresa of Jesus considered one of the most concrete and most effective acts the soul can perform to claim the territory of the home for the sacred and keep it under that claim in a sustained way. In The Way of Perfection, Saint Teresa of Jesus defends vocal prayer with a passion that surprises coming from someone whose mystical reputation is associated primarily with the highest forms of interior contemplation. She, who came to experience states of prayer the Church has recognized as extraordinary, belonging to the summit of Christian mystical life, insisted with a firmness her sisters knew well that vocal prayer made with genuine attention and active faith is not inferior to any form of contemplative prayer. And she added something that her most attentive readers have always underlined as one of the most practical principles of all her teaching, that the human voice speaking the name of God within a physical space has an effect on that space that silent prayer alone does not produce in the same way or with the same reach. The voice occupies, the voice fills, the voice claims the acoustic territory of the home for the one invoked in it. When a family prays aloud within their house, that sound travels through every room, enters every corner, fills every space of air with the name of God. And that saturation of physical space with the sacred is, in Teresa's understanding, a form of protection that no sacred object placed in silence on a shelf can fully replace. And Saint Teresa of Jesus observed about family vocal prayer, something that goes beyond its effects on the physical space of the home and touches something that no spiritual treatise since has been able to express with greater precision. That when the family prays together aloud, what is sealed is not only the material territory of the walls and rooms, but the relationships between those who inhabit that territory. The voices that join in prayer remind each person who speaks it that they are not alone in that home, that there are others under that same roof who are also seeking God, even if with clumsy words and the inevitable distraction of someone carrying the weight of an entire life on their shoulders. And that living memory of having prayed together, of having spoken the name of God together within those walls on Divine Mercy Sunday, is something that lasts beyond the moment when the prayer ends. It stays in the soul of each person who took part. It remains in the atmosphere of the home as a presence that evil will have to face every time it looks for passage, because it no longer finds empty territory, but a place that has been claimed with voice and name and the gathered faith of those who live there. There are families who have performed these 3 acts on a Divine Mercy Sunday, and who describe what happened afterward with words that resemble each other in a way that cannot be coincidence. Though the families don't know each other, though they come from different countries and completely different life circumstances, though some did it with the solemnity of long preparation, and others did it simply with what they had on hand at the time. They describe it as a change in the air of the house, not a dramatic transformation with spectacular signs and immediate results that could be photographed or measured. Something subtler in outward appearance and at the same time deeper in its interior reality. A shared sense among the members of the family, without anyone having said anything to anyone else, that something heavy that had been in the atmosphere of the home without anyone being able to name it has been lifted. An ease in prayer that before had required an effort that sometimes seemed out of proportion to what was received. A decrease in tension among family members that none of them can attribute to any external cause, because the external causes remain exactly the same as they were before Sunday. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew these signs with the familiarity of someone who had seen them many times. She had observed them in her Carmelite communities, when acts of consecration and spiritual renewal were carried out at what she considered moments of extraordinary grace in the liturgical calendar. She had experienced them in her own cell in the moments that followed her deepest acts of surrender to God. And she described them not as proof that the spiritual work was finished and the soul could rest without further effort, but as confirmation that something real had occurred in the spiritual territory of the home, and that this real thing now needed to be sustained by the continuity of the practices that had produced it. A confirmation given at the beginning of the road, not at the end. A sign that a door has opened, not that the destination has already been reached. Because one of the errors that Saint Teresa of Jesus warned against most frequently and most insistently with her Carmelite sisters, and that applies with equal precision to any Christian home that has experienced a moment of extraordinary grace, was this: believing that a moment of spiritual opening produces permanent results with no subsequent effort of maintenance. The grace of divine mercy, Sunday applied to the home through the three acts that Saint Teresa of Jesus described, opens a door, seals certain cracks, reinforces spiritual walls that had previously been weakened by neglect and habit emptied of content. But those walls need to be maintained. That door needs someone to keep standing at it with the same active faith that opened it. The protection that this Sunday can establish in the home is not an automatic system that runs indefinitely while the inhabitants live however they choose, with no relationship to what produced it. It is the solid, well-founded beginning of a way of living in the home that sustains and feeds what Sunday inaugurated, that deepens it over time rather than letting it wither through the return of the same habits that had created the original cracks. In the interior castle, Saint Teresa of Jesus describes interior life with the image of the castle that the soul inhabits and that needs to be defended on an ongoing basis. Not because God's grace is insufficient to sustain it alone, but because the soul has freedom, and that freedom can be used at any moment to open or close the doors of that castle. The same applies to the home that soul inhabits. The protection that Divine Mercy Sunday can establish in the walls of a house does not take away its inhabitants' freedom to keep choosing. It does not turn them into people incapable of reopening the cracks that Sunday sealed. It only gives them a firmer and higher starting point from which to build, a living spiritual memory of what the home can be when given to God without reserve or conditions, a foundation from which each small daily decision that aligns with what Sunday inaugurated goes on reinforcing something that over time becomes more robust and more resilient than it was when Sunday began. The Carmelite communities that followed Saint Teresa of Jesus' teaching on the renewal of the home on days of extraordinary grace developed over time a concrete practice that was passed down from generation to generation as a living part of their domestic spirituality. The commitment to sustaining after that Sunday at least 3 simple daily practices that would keep the protection established that day alive and active. The first was spoken prayer within the home at least once a day, even briefly, even if it was just the Our Father spoken together before bed, with awareness of what that act does in the space of the home. The second was the conscious and deliberate use of holy water coming and going, not by automatic habit, but with the same active faith with which the Sunday walk had been made, remembering each time what it is for and in whom one trusts. The third was the monthly renewal of the consecration of the home, not with the length and solemnity of Sunday, but with a simple and honest act of surrender, spoken aloud together as a family, remembering that the home belongs to God, and that belonging needs to be reaffirmed regularly so that it does not gradually become an intention that nobody mentions and that over time fades from the family's daily memory. These three practices are not complicated. They do not require extraordinary amounts of time or resources the ordinary family does not have. They require only what Saint Teresa of Jesus considered the foundation of any spiritual life capable of sustaining itself long term, the firm decision not to let the ordinary become the enemy of the sacred. The decision to keep burning the flame that Sunday lit, not to let the return of routine and weariness and the daily urgencies gradually extinguish something that took effort to light, and that, once lit and kept burning by the right practices, can sustain itself with far less effort than it took to kindle it the first time. There is a question that Saint Teresa of Jesus left planted in her writings in a way that her most attentive readers have always found extraordinarily precise in its framing. She did not leave it in a theological treatise. She did not leave it in an official document addressed to church authorities. She left it in her most personal writings, in those she wrote for her Carmelite sisters, in those she wrote as a practical guide for the interior journey of souls she knew by name, and whose struggles she knew with an intimacy that no theologian of her time could match, because none of them had governed communities of women for decades with the constant attentiveness that Saint Teresa of Jesus devoted to every soul entrusted to her care. The question is this: how does the soul know that the protection of its home has truly been established? How does it distinguish between the consoling feeling of having done something good and the certainty that something real has occurred in the spiritual territory of the space where it lives? Saint Teresa of Jesus did not answer this question with spiritual vagueness or with exhortations to have more faith and wait patiently. She answered it with something concrete, with something any soul can recognize, even without specialized theological formation or any particular mystical experience, with something that requires no visions or extraordinary revelations or any of the spiritual phenomena that accompanied some moments of her own life, which she herself always considered exceptional gifts God was not obligated to give anyone, and toward which she always recommended the utmost caution. The sign that Saint Teresa of Jesus described for recognizing that the home has been truly protected is completely ordinary in appearance, and that is precisely why most people who experience it do not recognize it as the sign it is. They feel it, they don't identify it. She called it simply the peace that cannot be explained, not the absence of problems, because the problems are still there with their full reality and weight, not the miraculous resolution of the situations causing suffering within the home, because Saint Teresa of Jesus knew real human life far too well to promise that the spiritual consecration and protection of the home would eliminate the pain that is part of living in a world that has not yet finished being redeemed. What she described was something different in its nature, and in a certain sense deeper than any resolution of external circumstances. A peace that coexists with problems without being destroyed by them. A serenity that does not depend on exterior conditions having improved, because it is rooted in something that exterior conditions do not control. Something that is inside the home at a level that the storms that come from outside do not reach as easily as before, because something in the territory has changed in a real way, even if it is not visible to the eyes of the body. In the interior castle, Saint Teresa of Jesus describes this peace with a distinction that her most faithful readers have always found unmistakable in its accuracy. She says it is recognizable because it is different from calm. calm is the absence of disturbance, a negative state defined by what is not there. The peace Saint Teresa of Jesus describes is an active presence, not the absence of something bad, but the concrete, perceptible presence of something good that occupies the space, and that evil cannot easily displace because it is rooted in something that does not depend on external conditions to exist, and that is not produced by human management of circumstances, but solely by the action of God in the soul and in the space that soul inhabits. It is the peace that St. Paul describes in his letter to the Philippians as the peace that passes all understanding, that guards the heart and mind in Christ Jesus, the one no human strategy can manufacture, the one that can only come from God, and that, when it comes, the soul recognizes precisely because it was never able to produce it by its own efforts, no matter how long or how hard it tried. This concrete sign is what Saint Teresa of Jesus left to her sisters as confirmation that the spiritual work of days of extraordinary grace had produced real fruit in the home, and not merely the consoling but passing sensation of having done something good. Not the sign that the home was now perfect, or that evil had disappeared forever and would never again try to find entry, but the sign that something in the relationship between that home and God had changed in a real and deep way. That the territory had been claimed with the concrete acts that this Sunday places within reach of any family that performs them in faith. That the cracks sealed on Sunday had truly been sealed and not just covered over superficially. That the walls reinforced on that Sunday of extraordinary mercy were standing and could be sustained if the family maintained the practices that nourished them. And here closes what this Sunday can do in your home if you allow it, with faith and with the interior honesty that Saint Teresa of Jesus considered the most fundamental requirement of any authentic spiritual act, not as magic that operates independently of the soul's disposition, not as an automatic guarantee of prosperity or freedom from suffering or the resolution of every difficulty life brings, but as what Saint Teresa of Jesus taught it to be with the full authority of her life and her writings, an opportunity of extraordinary grace that the Church places within the soul's reach once a year on the most merciful Sunday of the liturgical calendar, so that the Christian home may become what it was always meant to be, a consecrated territory, a space where the presence of God has the right to dwell because it has been invited with freedom and with unconditional love. A home where the name of God is spoken aloud and fills the rooms with something that evil cannot inhabit. A home where holy water is not an automatic gesture, but an act of faith that claims every corner for the light. A home where the peace that cannot be explained is recognized by those who feel it as the clearest sign that God is there. That the mercy this Sunday the Church proclaims with her full voice has come in through the doors that were open to it and has stayed. You have made it to the end because something in you knew that what this Sunday holds for your home was too important to let pass. And now you know. You know that Divine Mercy Sunday is not an ordinary Sunday for the Christian home. You know that Saint Teresa of Jesus left written with precision what this day can do within the walls where your family lives, if you allow it, in faith and in interior honesty. You know that the renewed consecration spoken with voice and names, the walk with holy water done in active faith and not by habit, and the family prayer spoken aloud that fills the space of the home with the name of God are three acts that together can seal what was open and strengthen what had grown weak. And you know how to recognize the sign. That peace that cannot be explained, that does not depend on circumstances having changed, that coexists with the problems without being broken by them. When you feel it in your home after this Sunday, recognize it. It is the mercy of God that stayed. Saint Teresa of Jesus spent the second half of her life building houses where God could be the center. But before she founded the first of her 17 convents, she learned in her own home what would be the foundation of everything she built afterward. that any home can become a dwelling place of God if those who live in it truly want it and do what that wanting requires. Not the extraordinary, the ordinary sustained in faith. What you have just heard is that foundation placed in your hands. Use it today, not tomorrow. Today, while the grace of this Sunday is still open over your home, like a door waiting for someone to decide to walk through it. And there is something more that Saint Teresa of Jesus taught about the spiritual life that does not end here. There are saints, there are writings, there are revelations the Church has preserved for centuries that have something concrete to say to your soul at this moment in its journey. There is a teaching waiting in the video that follows, born of the same heart of faith that has produced everything you have just received. Don't let it pass. What you received today was the beginning. The next step is waiting for you. May the mercy of God that we have proclaimed together today accompany every step you take from here. May your home be, from this Sunday forward, a dwelling where the peace that cannot be explained is the daily sign that God is within. Saint Teresa of Jesus, who knew that interior home better than anyone and who described it so that you might find it, intercedes today for you and for every person who lives under your roof. Until next time, with all the love in the world,